I debated with myself if I should sit or stand for this introductory remarks, but I think I'll stand. Welcome to our panel discussion titled, What Peace Got to Do with This? Peace Studies at the Intersection of Race, Class, and Gender. My name is Atalia Omer, and I'm an associate professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Koch Institute within the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Let us take a moment to acknowledge the past, present, and future elders of the Potawatomi people on whose land we stand. We recognize that we do not enter the conversation about peace today from a neutral place, and that such conversations in many contexts, including settlers' institutions like Notre Dame, have occurred within an unequal power dynamics. Such power dynamics and long histories of domination, racialization, and dehumanization are often myopically concealed from the theory and practice of peace. It is precisely the intersectional and decolonial lens that expose where the language, theories, and practices of peace have also been implicated in histories of violence. When we ask what peace got to do with race, gender, and class, we also ask questions on whose back does the discourse of peace have been implemented, whose labor, whose death and displacement. Most critically, we question the presumption of neutrality and an Archimedean view from nowhere, as if from nowhere, lest our land acknowledgement is an empty gesture. The conversation today intends to reflect on the cutting edges of peace studies, which intersect and converge as a field with critical race theory, cultural theory, gender and feminist theory, and other critical and humanistic disciplinary conversations that move beyond methodological nationalism, which assumes the nation state as the main unit of analysis and a container of social and political processes. So from this methodological nationalism to transnationalize and globalize the study of race, gender, and class. In other words, critical and humanistic tools also foreground questions about the enduring legacies of colonialism, the global scope of systems of racialization, the thefts of lands, cultures, and people, and multiple genocides ingrained onto the story of progress, civilization, development, and yes, the violent legacies of peace itself as a concept and mechanism not always on the same page with justice. While I refer to such modes of questioning and scholarly inquiry that engage critically with the Eurocentricity of the field as being at the cutting edges of peace studies, this may be more an aspiration rather than a descriptive statement about the state of the field. Indeed, they may be more aptly labeled the critical edges rather than the cutting edges, and rather than the center of peace research, such edges may most aptly be further characterized as margins. Hence today is a discussion of the critical margins of peace research. The so-called cutting edges of peace theory and practice are found elsewhere in a synergetic approach to development and peace building, very clearly threaded through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of UN Agenda 2030. In particular, as many of us here are aware of, Goal 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, and Goal 17, Partnership for the Goals, set the tone for synergies and pathways for linking peace-building foci with development efforts such as those telegraphed in Goals 1 through 15, including Goal 1, no poverty, Goal 5, gender equality, and Goal 10, reduce inequalities. These synergies illuminate, to a certain degree, the relevance of questions of structural violence to instability and hot or direct violence. Relatedly, Goal 16, in particular, brings to the fore the study of institutions, governance, and so forth as critical dimensions of development, understood as increasing human flourishing globally. Goal 17, meanwhile, with its focus on partnership, underscores the role of investment in the private sector in attaining the goals, a point that stands in tension with what I referred to earlier as the critical margins of peace studies. While the links drawn between inequality and violence exposes why peace research needs to be concerned with justice along socioeconomic, cultural, historical, epistemic, and symbolic levels, the emphasis on partnership and investment functions myopically to conceal global structural and historical injustices that remain otherwise intact. When one brings insights from critical race and gender theory, as well as an interrelated decolonial lens, a critique of the operative logic of exploitative capitalism and its entanglement with colonialism and neocolonialism come to the fore, this time through an analysis of how peace theory and practice proceed within a neoliberal frame, which is our moment's global design to invoke a concept articulated by scholar of decoloniality Walter Mignolio at Duke, and which he interprets through a long historical lens that identifies the transformation of universalizing discourses from conversion into theological cosmology to conversion into development paradigms. The framing of the Sustainable Development Goals is decidedly not intersectional if by intersectionality we mean, and here building on the massive intellectual labor of primarily African American and other women of color from the global South or the many South of the North, this is a prism through which to comprehend realities invisibilized through conventional disciplines, including peace research. Indeed, you may think to yourself that concerns with a long historical account of the intersection of race, gender, and class are luxurious sides of inquiry that do not belong in the immediate and pragmatic concerns of peace as the reduction of violence. Here, it is important to convey and underscore that the task at hand is to think about race, gender, and class intersectionally rather than in isolation from one another. And so the massive industry of women and peace, or gender and peace, and the legacy of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against women, while denoting major sites of feminist work within the peace building and development frame, are not necessarily intersectional in their analytic purchase on the interlocking and crisscrossing patterns of race, dehumanization, and domination. But thinking about the interlocking structures of power and ideologies authorizing them, transnationally and globally disrupting methodological nationalism, is entirely consistent with foundational conversations in peace studies that did take seriously structural, cultural, and symbolic violence as sites of inquiry complexly related to direct violence. Here we illuminate how such expansion that many of us wrote about and thought about in cultivating the concept of strategies of peace as multidimensional, architectonic, normatively oriented to social and economic justice and privileging the margins and indigenous agency and moral imaginations can be further emboldened through a critical discourse that is itself emancipatory. So intersectionality has become rather ubiquitous recently, risking cooptation, as Patricia Hill Collins warns, by the neoliberal academy and patterns of identity politics. She is worried about the dulling of its critical edges, especially its underlying critique of socioeconomic exploitation, generative of multiple pathways of solidarity across identity boundaries. Therefore, it is important to reflect and recall intersectionality's political and critical edges. Further, intersectionality involves an understanding of race, gender, class as constitutive of one another rather than additive, and also offers a prism through which to understand global structures of power, domination, and exploitation, as well as apparently benevolent effort to respond to human suffering without disrupting the underlying logics of such structures. Hence, taken this way as an analytic lens, it doesn't only deepen our account of violence and oppression, but also imbues an emancipatory politics. A focus on such emancipatory politics is obviously, or should be, within the scope of peace research. If intersectionality is about the analysis of power and interlocking systems of oppression, it also asks, as Patricia Hill Collins does, what will it take for Black people to be free? And you can expand the category Black to include other people. This mode of questioning foregrounds and the ethical aspiration of scholarship. It reveals the important and non-binary links between theory and practice. For example, questions about moving power through social movement action, or the articulation of resistance knowledge programs to redress the epistemological violence that define our disciplines. This tension between the cutting edges and the critical margins of peace studies reveal a curious moment for the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. On the one hand, we are in the midst of a process of incorporation into a School of Global Affairs that centralizes development discourses. On the other, as a result of a collective conversation among us, we determined the need to centralize intersectionality as an analytic lens in thinking about the next phases of peace research in ways that centralize, again, questions of racial, gender, and economic justice, and transformative processes that unsettles methodological nationalism and dispels the Archimedean myopias. As a result, we are not only pulled in the direction of development studies, but also in the direction of fields of inquiry that question some of the foundational assumptions of progress narratives and neo-colonial discourses. It is no wonder that today's session is co-sponsored by the Notre Dame Department of Africana Studies, the Gender Studies Program, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I have now the privilege to moderate a conversation with my esteemed colleagues here. So we have Professor David Hooker, Professors David Hooker, Perin Gurel, Ashley Bohrer, and Susan St. Ville. This conversation intends to mark International Day of Peace. We are core faculty, curriculum builders, and faculty fellows at the Kroc Institute, and we each devoted significant time over careers and lives thinking about identities in intersectional ways, which expose the patterns and underpinning logics of structural, cultural, symbolic, epistemic, and direct forms of violence. Some of us also devoted some time to study cultural discourses as key locations for the analysis of political practice and violence. The challenge that peace studies poses to an intersectional analysis of power relies exactly in our capacity to both deepen our analysis of violence in all its forms, centralize historical injustices and claims and epistemologies from the margins, but also think constructively and creatively about emancipatory transformation and what would it look like. If cultural productions are so critical as an explanatory framework of violence, what might it mean to engage constructively and seriously on the levels of cultural discourses? What skills, resources, knowledges might be conducive? It is here that peace research can involve a more robust focus on the arts and humanistic inquiry through constructive engagement with divergent ethical, political, and aesthetic imaginations of the world otherwise. So a few words about the format moving from this moment. We thought that rather than a stale presentation style, we'll facilitate the conversation in a more organic way. So the panelists received very big questions in advance. I encouraged them to offer their own questions that they wanted to be asked, but they didn't take me up on the offer. So, so we'll work through the questions, and hopefully the tension will build up just in time to open it up for a more broader conversation. So, so I thought to start with Susan Saint-Ville. Dr. Saint-Ville is the director of the International Peace Studies concentration at the Keough School of Global Affairs. And I want to ask you, Susan, why do you think that bringing an intersectional lens to peace studies makes peace study more robust?
Thank you. I didn't know I was going to be the first, but
yes.
I'm happy.
I trust you. That's fine.
I'm really happy to speak to that. I think you touched on a number of the elements that are really crucial with intersectional analyses. And, you know, the first, of course, is what we normally gravitate towards, which is that an intersectional analysis that looks at the vectors of race and class and gender and the multiple components that make identities and ideas has a real central focus in helping us critique the standard theories that we've had and to show us the ways in which they have been blind to various levels of experience and the experience of various publics. So of course there's, you know, the first is just the calling to task of the traditional gender or the traditional peace studies theories. And then I think the deeper level has to do with the way in which when we look at intersectional thinking, we start to move away from thinking about just the static concepts that we want to try to promote and more to the process of what goes into making any particular concept. And so being very careful about tracing the historical and social and structural elements that feed into any one of our ideas. So on the one hand, it's a critique of the ideas themselves, but it's also a move to a different mode of thinking that is process-based. And then I can't help but say that when I got the question, I thought robust feels like the wrong word to me. So maybe because I think because it seems to carry the implication that if peace studies is more robust, then the claims that we make can be more authoritatively made. And I feel like intersectional thinking, one of the benefits is that because it always knits in that critical lens, it also has to make us aware of the way in which we are putting forward our own claims. Because precisely the way that we do violence in peace discourse is by being overly authoritative. So hopefully an intersectional analysis, and I hope this with our students, helps them to make claims, but also to make them in a way that is more nuanced, more open to critique, more open to dialogue. So I would quibble a little bit with robust. But...
Okay, yeah, thank you for calling, for identifying that very gendered language that filtered into the framing of the question. This is really important. So, Dr. Bohrer, maybe you can say a few words about what race, class, gender, what does it have to do with peace?
Oh, so a small question.
Small question.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Atalia. So I think one of the ways we might think about this, and to sort of speak to the previous question as well, is that one of the things that intersectionality brings to peace research is, I think, also the deep commitment to the idea that peace research needs to focus also inside the context in which we live, right? That intervention into sort of armed conflicts and other areas of the world is not the only way, or even necessarily the primary way or the privileged way to enter into peace research. And we can see that when we look at, you know, this context, the United States as a settler, colonial, capitalist, heteropatriarchal entity, right, that undoing or addressing or critically apprising the forms of structural and cultural and interpersonal and self-inflicted violence that appear in our own context is really at the forefront, I think, of what intersectionality can bring and can offer. And I think one of the other sort of most important ways that intersectionality threads through race, gender, sexuality, class, incarceration status, immigration status, and we could go on, is thinking about the relationship between the experiential and the personal and the structural. So I think many of the theories that certainly, I was trained in, and many of us might identify as kind of conceptual backgrounds that we bring, are focused on one or the other, right? Theories of interpersonal relationships, theories of self-inflicted violence, or theories of structural violence. And I think one of the benefits of intersectionality, and one of the places in which it's the most, I was going to say robust, complex, nuanced, capacious, right, is in the way that it links personal and interpersonal experiences to larger structures of power in a multifaceted, multi-causal sort of way that I think can expand the way that we think about what race or what gender or what class or what about class has to do with peace studies broadly.
So before we walk away from that, it would be helpful for me as a professor of practice.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
right?
I was going to introduce you.
As a professor of practice, I appreciate the kind of theoretical ideas, the way that you all are saying them. It would be helpful for me if either or both of you would point to something that we would see on the ground to help us understand how what you just said matters.
Do you want to take it?
Go ahead first. This is, of course, the really important question. So, I mean, for me, the way it matters in terms of training practitioners is in training them about the way in which they go into a situation. And so I think this picks up on Ashley's point that, you don't so easily split the experiential and the theoretical. So that you have, when you have an intersectional lens, it really forces you to see the way in which your own experiential kind of disposition inflects through the work that you do. And so I think if you do that kind of work in a more standard way, the risk is that you go in with a sense that the programs that you're initiating are, going to work, and they're authoritatively to be implemented. I think if you go in with an intersectional mindset, you may go in with programs that you are more likely to draw in local actors, that you're less likely to impose in, kind of from the top down. So that's the immediate practical valence of it. And I think most practitioners struggle with that.
Can I add something to that? Yeah, so I think if I were thinking about how this research matters, I might think about it in sort of three different ways, or three questions that I think intersectionality prompts us to think in any sort of practical application, whether that's a policy application, whether that's a grassroots sort of organizing perspective, whether that's NGO work. And the sort of three areas are, one, like, what are my assumptions, or what are the assumptions of what the problem is, right? On whose experience are those assumptions based, right? So if I'm looking at a problem or a question of sexism, whose experience of sexism am I looking toward? Am I most sensitive to? Whose problem is this solving? And what are the ways in which that might actually be furthering some group's marginalization? I also think about it in terms of the way intersectionality puts the social location of the researcher or the practitioner into question as a really central question for doing justice-based work, practice, and research. So how does, for example, my whiteness frame what questions appeal to me, what factors I'm interested in investigating, whose voice I perceive as authoritative, what personal connections I have to leverage in a particular situation. And intersectionality prompts us to be very critical of the ways in which our own social locations are sometimes determinative of the approach we're going to take, or the question we're even going to ask, or what we are even going to see as a problem. And then I think in the third way, the question is, who needs to be consulted, right? Who needs to be involved in a practice or a policy-based solution? And how do we center marginalized communities in solving problems that affect them, rather than, I think, relying on some more top-down policy-based solutions, especially when the groups of people most likely to be involved in that top-down setting are frequently not the groups most deeply affected by oppression and exploitation.
Maybe, David, maybe you can respond to this from your experience as in practice, especially speak to the point, this last point about the kind of the epistemic communities, the know-how, where the know-how is located, who are the experts in terms of thinking on the ground about peace building processes and moral imaginations.
So the initial entree into any community that we're going to engage in is that the community itself has to have both the privilege and the responsibility to define, lead, own, benefit from, and sustain whatever change or transformation they're going to experience. If we start with a deep and broad consultation to establish the definition, then I'm less concerned about my gaze on their defining the problem. Because once they've defined it, then I have to assume that they both have the capacities, the intellectual, the traditional, the local knowledge necessary to begin to develop the strategies to analyze and respond to it. And so the frameworks that I bring are for the academy and other folks when I'm writing about it. Certainly not when we're doing it, right? And so the engagement is their structure, they're defining it. I do think that it's really important to be able to get to those places where, you know, locally people have been marginalized, that they're not involved in traditional conversations. But this is where I think a kind of a surface or a thinly constructed intersectional frame impacts us, because people will say, well, in order to fully understand, we have to hear from the women, we have to hear from the youth, we have to hear from, and so it's still a very essentializing conversation. And then we say, well, we've done that. And so then if we can convene a Congress that has some women, some youth, some elders, you know, a couple of religious representative, cross-religious representative in it, then we've done our intersectional work. And so there's a way in which even the notions of intersectionality get co-opted in the production of the work. And so how then do we push beyond that to consider kind of the valences that people live in? Because there are some women who are privileged and have access to a certain, you know, they benefit from traditional arrangements in ways that they're not necessarily contributing to the demarginalization, the improving the lives of all of the women, all of the youth, all of the elders, the broader structure. So I think that it's really important in our practice to not let the illusion of intersectionality actually allow us to achieve a more deep and robust set of exchanges.
Yeah, and what you echoed right now, what you said right now echoes the point about that Patricia Hill-Collins made that I alluded to, of the kind of the neoliberalization, the neoliberal cooptation of intersection, not in intersectionality, it's sectors, what you described as sectors, the women's sector, the youth sector that plays out in peace building practices.
Right. And so, Ignacio Martin Barro, in his trying to develop a framework for the community, because a lot of times we use that, the community, this is designed for the community, as a way of really just replicating the hierarchy. So how do we look for the people who have been negatively impacted, their voices, their political and civil participation, their capacities. And so you look at the edges of society, like who's falling out, who's constantly negatively impacted, and begin the conversations there, and then privilege those, you know, previously kind of veiled voices as the starting point for the conversation, and require that they establish the agenda and everybody else is actually contributing to their agenda, as opposed to building an agenda and then inviting them in.
Okay, I want to invite Perin to jump in, and I also want to say very briefly that I didn't want to stand up, but I'm standing up because I couldn't see this part of the room, and especially I couldn't see Jason. So,
That's important.
Which is very important, yeah. So, Perin.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and especially if you can speak from the perspective of your research.
Yeah. So I'm a cultural historian of U.S. and the Middle East. So that keeps getting pulled in some ways into peace studies, because I am really interested in it. So my comments will come from that background, and I will ask questions to your questions. So I've been wondering, what is the relationship between peace studies, integral human development, and anti-imperialism, which is a key concern for me, anti-imperialism. And then what is the relationship between anti-imperialism and intersectionality? And I'm so grateful that you pointed out the importance of those long histories of domination and continuing of global structures of power, because that is kind of my concern and what I'm looking at. And in some representations of peace studies, and certainly in some representations of development, including what I read about integral human development, I see a horizontal expansion of the idea, but not historical depth necessarily. Specifically, the emphasis on colonialism and the slave trade, and continuing echoes of racism as a structure and sexism as structural, and their role in actively underdeveloping some parts of the world seems to me to be not highlighted enough. So, you know, we have so much work, you know, by Walter Rodney, Wallerstein, Miolo, that talk about how development is not sort of this straight or parallel line, like some people developed and some people just ended up not developing, but some groups' development was built on the active underdevelopment of other groups, right? And there's a connection to race, sexism, and class there, and capitalism, obviously. So I'm also really grateful to your comments, because intersectionality isn't a magical word that's going to sort of immediately fix it, or just sort of essentialist. I have one of these, I have one of these, I have one of these, and then great, I'm done, right? I think partially because there are, as you point out, some very parochial applications of the term that go against some of the theorizations, but even in the early theorizations, this sort of intellectual legacy of asking who's left out or who's multiply burdened does not necessarily lead to investigation of positions of privilege and power. Right? So, when we do sort of international history, we are doing the opposite of that, but in a non-critical way, like, oh, this white man said this, and like that this person said this. So it's very much about who has power, who's making decisions. And then very often the opposite side of that is this, like, but who was left out, who didn't get to speak? And we need to kind of put these in conversation with each other. So you made this great point about who gets left out and who, and sort of in some of the stuff I read about integral human development, like leave no one behind, but how were they made behind? Who left them out? And so I think those questions in transnational American studies and in my field are very important. So how did we make this? You know, what do we owe? And not in terms of charity, but in terms of reparations and justice. So intersectionality, I think, does bring a really important lens to anti-imperialism. That it reminds us that anti-imperialism has to be anti-sexist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, all of those things. But somehow I need to see more accountability in some of these representations, just from my background.
Great. So maybe we can hear from others on the panel about your understanding of the relationship between intersectionality theory and practice, and intersectionality as emancipatory politics and development discourses.
I don't know if it talks directly to that, but as you were both talking, I mean, the thought that often comes to mind is that we want to use the intersectional theories to bring in the voices that haven't been heard. But I don't think we spend enough time acknowledging those voices that have just simply been eliminated.
Eliminated.
Simply been eliminated. And that, you know, that are in some sense not able to be brought back into the conversation. And how do we let those have a mark on the ways in which we go forward? Because I feel like there's just always this haunting in the background. And that's sort of a limiting force.
Yeah, and something in what Perin said about, you know, the discourse of like who gets left behind, it's also like, where are we going, right? Like, what are they left behind from, right? And who gets to set the terms of the conversation around what are we developing toward? And as I think, you know, a strength of intersectionality as a theory has been a long history of critiquing the discourse of inclusion into systems that are predicated on domination and oppression. And so it's not just a question of who is included in a conversation, but also what direction, what are we aiming toward as a goal, and how are those goals potentially themselves oppressive, right?
And so I think that speaks to this idea that I've been trying to work with more, which is how do you allow communities to articulate for themselves a preferred narrative of a shared future, not a shared narrative of a future, but a preferred narrative of a shared future where everybody has the opportunity to kind of, this is that, you know, capabilities notion that everybody has the opportunity to survive, thrive, and make full contribution, but they're doing it from within the theoretical and knowledge systems of the locality. So how do we, so like part of our development is we take an assumption about a preferred outcome, you know, kind of the notion that dignity comes from work is an interesting idea. Dignity ought to show up and then not necessarily be required to be attached to labor markets and the opportunities to be, you know, participate in somebody else's kind of exploitative systems. And so how do we create spaces where people can name that from their own knowledge systems and knowledge traditions? And so what I'm interested in for like historical investigation is where and how, what are the methodologies for unveiling the inquiry systems that were, the inquiry and theoretical frameworks that were part of kind of the more indigenous knowledge systems, the thing that they were working with. And then can we inquire from that and use that as the basis for defining where we're going and why folks are left or not left?
Does part of that though also have to be, when you get a preferred narrative, also having an awareness of the way in which that preferred narrative itself starts to lead other perspectives and do violence?
And so this is why it's not a shared narrative. It's a narrative of a shared future. Like if it's a shared narrative, then that automatically embeds a power structure. We work through and the narrative gets developed from places of power. If it's a narrative of a shared future, it's like your narrative and my narrative of where we're going don't necessarily have to align. What they have to do where we work through the conflict is where your future is impeding mine. right? Those are the only places where we actually have conflict. Otherwise, we don't have to actually travel together. So this notion of where we're going, it's not that we all have to go to the same places. It's like we have to go, you have to go in ways that don't impede my capacity to do and live the kind of life that I'm trying to live, which in some ways for me is challenging when we get to some of the cultural traditional ways of thinking and engaging and incorporating folks. I would like to believe that there's this individual flourishing, individual human flourishing, some of which is encouraged in integral human development. And I'm not sure necessarily that the individual flourishing should be our primary unit of analysis or measure of success, right? If the collective and the wisdom of the collective is sufficiently put forward, then how do we allow kind of individual flourishing within that, but not privileging that individual flourishing as the primary goal or outcome?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Susan, but I thought that your intervention just now was to caution against the inclination to valorize and reify indigenous traditions in ways that do not allow for like processes of double critique of historical engagement with the traditions. So kind of we see a process of projection into some sort of a purist pre-colonial thing. And so this needs to also be brought into account. David, in your, even the language of in the individual in itself is something that you already alluded to, how it needs to be unsettled if you bring indigenous and communal approaches to questions of flourishing and so forth. So it's interesting to highlight the traces of that individualist language and the individual as a locus of the basic unit of analysis, and how it plays into all those discourses that we examine in critical ways.
Can I ask another question? I'm wondering how my colleagues think about this even concept of race, class, gender, all of those concepts in the light of these questions, because there's a way in which they are a certain inherentness of the type of modernity that's tied with Western ideology. And I don't have an answer to it, but I was wondering how people sort of manage that, because it seems like we need to take account of those factors, but they don't always look the same, right? And then they are kind of, they sometimes do end up in identitarian ways, as we discussed.
Great. Ashley, do you want to take this one? You were nodding, so.
Excuse me. Great. Lovely. So, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this question. One of the places that I initially go is that while I agree with you, for sure, that a lot of these concepts are legacies of, white heteropatriarchal colonial capitalism and its ideology, for sure, meaning it is generated out of conditions of domination. It is not enough to make a literary reference, to pull a Bartleby and to say, oh, I prefer not, right? I prefer not to engage with them because they are concepts that come from, a bad or a dominating genealogy. The fact is that these concepts and their practices, right, the way in which they are lived and continue to be reproduced, is a fact of the world that we live in. And so in contesting them, which I think we need to, right, in much more complex ways than I think, especially we as scholars are often prone to do, I think we need to wrestle with this sort of double-sidedness that this critique always needs to take, which is, I can't refuse the grammar of the world that I am given, but nor do I have to simply accept it, right? There are ways to use these concepts in ways to sort of turn them back around on themselves. And I think that's maybe the first place that I would go, is that the word that comes to me is a dialectical reading, right, of these terms, where they contain within themselves the seeds of their own undoing even as they carry a legacy of domination within them.
I think I would agree. I mean, I think the way I would go with it is that they, it's undeniable that at different historical moments, those categories bear incredible force. But that doesn't mean to say that they are, complete unified categories. And so if we look at them in a dialectical or what I would say a very historical way, and we go to the process of how they're functioning at any given point in time, we can maybe have both a sense of the force that they have, but also they're not totalizing concepts.
But I think that I agree with the direction or the trajectory of what you just said. I want to challenge or resist this idea that we have to accept the language, because the language is a precondition of thought. And so if we use if we allow the language in its current forms, then it hides a lot. So we say this happens because of race, right? Or this is the way that race is impacting this situation. And if we unpack that to say, we're using slightly different language to say, this is the way that kind of, it's more awkward, but a racialized gaze is used to distribute, or a colored or, ethnically coded gaze is used to distribute resources and things like that. It's a more awkward, but it at least unveils what the working of those concepts are in ways that allows us to acknowledge them, but not accept them as facts.
Sure. I mean, I think we can have historically constituted nuanced understandings of these terms. I would, for example, never say race causes anything. Racism causes things, right? Race is not any sort of natural, biological, or essential fact in the world, and neither is gender or any of these other things, but they are constructions that have social force. And while I agree with you that language is a precondition for thought or affects our thought, I don't think solving this problem in language solves it in reality, right? Which means that I think we need to do both, right? Use and critique terms, potentially sometimes invent new terms, but I think sometimes academics are prone to what I would call a certain kind of idealist, maybe navel gazing, which is that simply by inventing new concepts, we've solved problems. And I don't think we have.
Okay, so the final question, I feel the tension is building up. And yes, this is by design. My final question before we open up for everybody to participate and engage critically with the questions. I want to ask the panelists to reflect on the what may be the limitations of the intersectional frame, both analytically and in terms of the imagination of emancipatory politics.
I'll just repeat my kind of comment about embracing the intersection.
Okay.
Which is so important, but then sometimes I do wonder if it takes the gaze away from interrogating the powerful. That's my main concern.
Okay. So keep going.
Oh, okay. So I don't know how, we probably don't have time, but it's basically coming from Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the word, this idea that you need to focus on multiply marginalized subjects and embrace that intersection in order to move towards sort of a more just situation, which is extremely important, sort of highlighting people who have been sort of rendered voiceless or whose claims, in the case of Crenshaw's formalization, for legal justice has been denied. And I just wonder sometimes how, I think about how much we need to combine that with holding power accountable, this idea of accountability, in addition to a sort of inclusion, the ways in which that can, I don't think Patricia Hill Collins or Kimberly Crenshaw or anybody is doing that, but sometimes it can turn into an inclusionary narrative as opposed to sort of a more radical anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-sexist narrative.
I mean, I think to go along with that, the area that intersectional inquiry always struggles, and I think it has answers, but is how do you make those claims of justice forcefully, and how do you constitute agency that can speak to human rights and in an authoritative way. So on the one hand, it's terrific at tempering authority, but I think it needs more development in terms of talking about what do we then mean by authority. And then also, I think as we've seen, the highly theoretical level of the discussions, even though it has really granular and important impacts on the ground, there's still a fissure there.
So there's a way in which I think the primary limitation is that intersectionality offers a critical lens. And that critical analysis is really helpful, but what the critical lens often does is cause people to fall in love with the problem, as opposed to finding ways to engage and imagine what's on the other side of it. And so what would be helpful is for folks who are engaging in the analysis to also have some equally fervent commitment to identifying what's possible by utilizing this as a way going forward.
One, I suppose, interrelated question that I have and I've grappled with in depth of a particular context is, so what would the emancipatory moment, how would it look like? Would it look the same everywhere? And if not, what are the other resources that come into play in the process?
Well, but that's the question. Is Patricia Hill Collins, is what will it take for Black to be free? Well, Black, because it's a political condition.
Yeah.
So it's that same question in wherever. What is the Blackness here as a political condition? What does that look like in this context as opposed to any other?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few limitations of intersectionality, even as someone who works on it, maybe because I'm someone who works on it. One of the things that I would say is I think the way that intersectionality has been used is almost as an ontological claim. So like race and gender and sexuality and class are interlinked in specific ways that might vary historically and might vary geographically, but anywhere you go, there is intersectionality. And I wonder, or I think intersectionality has more to do precisely about the question that Perin raised around imperialism and coloniality. What does it mean for there to be a claim, a universal claim about how the world is structured, enunciated from a very particular perspective or a particular social location? And I think that's a deep tension in how people navigate intersectionality that I think needs to be pushed forward in order to answer the emancipatory question.
Great, thank you. So let's open it up. Oh, wait a second, microphone, wait for the microphone. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Erin Cork, and I'm the executive director of the Kroc Institute. I'm actually going to be asking this question not from myself, but we actually have been live streaming this conversation, and we have people from all over the world. Many of our MGA students who are currently on their field placements who have been listening in. And so this comes from Raul Mukherjee, and his question is this: do you think that gaps in race, class, and gender can be reduced by using sports as a tool?
My inclination is to say yes, depending on how it's used.
Using sports.
If you've been to soccer games in Europe or football.
The way you would use arts, I think, in peace practice, it seems like a peace practice question.
Yeah, and
you are peace studies.
Yeah.
So all of those art, sports, all what they often do, theater, we use all of those mechanisms, and they often create an illusion of kind of improvement. Like the fact that people get along doesn't in any way undo the structural, epistemological narratives that create violence in their lives otherwise. And so they can be together and enjoy one another on the field and, embrace great competition and all of those other kinds of things. And the ethnic barriers can break down every place except in the European League. But that doesn't necessarily move us. And in fact, it may hide what remains, because we're getting along. We don't want to argue about and contest the privileges and the discriminations that otherwise exist. So.
Hi, thank you all for this really interesting and provocative reflections.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, I'm Ann Vishy. I'm a professor of sociology and peace studies here at the Kroc Institute. So I wanted to bring it back to practice, but a different kind of practice, not just development and peace building practice, but the practices that Atalia had alluded to at the beginning about social movements and various kinds of contestations of both structures and discourses, classificatory systems that exclude and oppress. As you know, we're competing right now with the global climate change strike, which is unfolding around the world, as we speak. So I'm wondering if you guys could just share with us and kind of the broader audiences examples of social movements that do intersectionality well and those that do intersectionality badly. And I think that because I think social movements are also peace building practice, and so I think but we want to understand the variety of ways in which social movements kind of embrace or fail to embrace the kinds of challenges that you guys have laid out here.
Maybe you can say a few words of what you think movements that do it well and don't, since that's your expertise.
Well, I think there's a lot of expertise at this table, but it's something actually that the environmental movement and the climate change movement has wrestled with. I think more recently they've gone to a more intersectional focus with the focus on climate justice, but that's partial and unfolding in different ways around the world. So it's been interesting to see in which like the question of indigenous peoples or people of color or people from more marginal parts of the world, the global south being more adversely affected by environmental degradation of various sorts and climate change than other parts of the world. And so there are parts of the global climate change movement that have embraced this analysis, and there are others which still seem very white, middle class. So that would be one example of a movement that is both trying, in some segments of it, trying to do it well, and in others is not going as far as it could. But I know that a lot of you have thought about these movements, so I'm wondering examples that you have.
Ashley, do you want to take this one? I know you thought about it.
Atalia and I are going to talk about this afterward. So I think something that happens a lot in social movements, especially large-scale social movements, is that there is an internal tension between being as inclusive as possible, like gaining numbers, and having deep clarity of conviction with a thick, really robust perspective on what the problem is. And so I actually see the tension that you name in the climate justice movement play out in many, many social movements, in the feminist movement and racial justice movements, in the sort of burgeoning democratic socialist movement in the United States and elsewhere, in decolonial movements, which is that the more developed or specific the analysis, right, that will often tend toward understanding the multiple touch points between an oppressive system and various groups, the harder it is to gain large-scale momentum. And so I think the tension you name is a real one, and a place that many social movements have more work to do about developing that approach in a way that doesn't come at the expense of force, power, community building. And I think really the greatest moments or examples we have of real intersectional work is in coalition-based movements rather than in more narrow or siloed movements.
I think Atalia's, your work kind of speaks to this a little bit.
I'll stay out of it.
Like even when you think about the Women's March and the splintering that happened around race and Zionism, and exactly the sort of the dynamic that we saw where it was like, well, that's not feminism. Well, then no, that's not feminism. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, or I guess I want to highlight.
I'll just go to the audience. So
thank you all very much. Susan Page, I'm a visiting professor of the practice at Keough. So I like the analysis of intersectionality, but I do wonder about, for instance, on the race issue, where the United States has a particular history and approach to race, so much so that when Africans come to the United States, they learn for the first time, and I don't mean this in a silly way, but for the first time they are defined as Black, whereas at home, well, of course, but everyone else is too. And so in your research, how do you define these different characteristics that come from the geographical, historical backgrounds that are not the same? And then similarly, I would say in terms of the culture, one of the classes that I've been teaching is on diplomacy and statecraft. And when you think of cultural diplomacy under the guise of public diplomacy, we don't, in the United States, we don't really have a national culture, a national art. So when we send people abroad or on exchanges, what exactly are we sending abroad? To represent capitalism, to represent freedom, liberty, choice, that may or may not exist in various communities in the United States, but it made sense in some ways during the Cold War, but once that ended, where do we go without having a sort of real national identity that we can say, you know, jazz is particularly American, or et cetera? So thanks.
I think the cultural diplomacy question, I think about that too a lot. And after the Cold War, we also started to have the new reiteration now with Muslim hip hop, right? Because Muslims aren't oppressed. Look how free they are. So you, obviously it's not certain Muslim artists, right, that are the anti-imperialist, that are outspoken anti-imperialist, but that, you know, under George Bush then we started to have. So it seems that there's a great intersection between racialization within the United States and this cultural diplomacy. So, you know, right, just as the jazz tours attempted to counter this idea that United States is sort of racist. Look at these people playing together, right? They're jamming. It's awesome. And then we have Muslim rappers. So the connection, I think, is very interesting. And then your question, I can only repeat it. How does this then get read for different places where race might mean something different, or people imagine different coalitions or different categories of relating, like the third worldism of Cold War and continuing sort of third worldism. So I second your question. I can't answer it. But the intersections between sort of domestic categories and international relations are extremely important.
Ashley, do you want to speak to this, and maybe you can link to Perin's point about the Women's March, and you know, try to make those connections.
Yeah. So I think there's something interesting about the case of the United States, not in an exceptionalism way, but I think there are ways in which there are what we might call sort of domestic internal relations of racialization or structures of racialization. And as an imperialist world power, that concept of racialization is also operative internationally with a lot of force in many particular ways.
Can I clarify? Maybe I'm not sure you understand.
Wait. Can you wait a second so that?
Sorry, what I'm talking about is, you know, the notion in America that if you have a drop of Black blood, you're Black.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not the same in other contexts and in other countries. So if you're mixed race, you're Black. It doesn't matter what the other mix is in terms of the characterization. So that's what I'm trying to get at. And where if you grew up in an African country, yes, you have the history with colonialism and whoever the colonial power was, but you didn't have that same concept of exclusion because everyone you see is another Black person, with some exceptions, obviously. But that's what I'm trying to get at. So you don't have quite the same exclusion on the basis of race, but it might be on class, it might be on ethnicity, religion, etc. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
I think that the point got across.
Yeah. So the one thing I would say about this is intersectionality, I think, is a theory about the way that multiple kinds of oppressive structures are interlinked. Solving or answering a question in a particular place about how those interrelations are organized is, let's say, an intersectional question, but it's not a question of intersectionality as a theory, right? So there are lots of people doing very interesting work in all kinds of historical and geopolitical contexts answering this question. So like, and in various kinds of scales. So like, how were race relations in the north of the United States different than the race relations that obtained right in the Deep South, that were different from the sort of colonial race relations inside places that were colonized by Spain, for example. So like inside Mexico, what were the relationships across the US-Mexico border? How did racialization change as that border changed? Those are deeply important historical questions that pull on what Patricia Hill Collins has called the matrix of domination. So the shape of any particular way that oppression is organized is a question that can only be answered specifically and historically and not universally or theoretically.
I think just to add on to that too, it is about tracing the matrix of domination, but also that in doing that, you can see what falls between the cracks and what in any given situation the emancipatory possibilities might be. So it does, I think it's important that it goes both ways.
And how US categories might be in this moment pushing into those local categories. So when you didn't think of yourself as a person of color, you begin to when you think about when you look at the structure of the United Nations.
Yeah, and also relations between between countries that are not mediated only by the United States, the global north and its categories. Like third worldism is third world internationalism is a really great example of the kind of multi-layered, not necessarily homogenization of categories, but cohesion of an analysis across many of these sites, not in spite of their differences, but informed by them.
And in response to colonial categories.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So we have a question from David Courtwright.
Yeah, David Courtwright at the Kroc Institute. It's been a great discussion. We haven't talked much about class. So I want to think, what has class got to do with it? And when earlier we used the phrase left behind, and there's big parts of the American white working class who had this self-perception, perhaps rightly so, in terms of how the whole society industrial system has put them on the short end of what's available. And I come out of a working class background in my youth, and the working class that I knew, and to some extent still today, is deeply susceptible to racism.
Mhm.
And even today, anti-immigrant feeling, Islamophobia is not uncommon. And it's one of the factors that is contributing to reactionary political currents in this country and in other countries. So how do we address that in the context of all these other influences?
So my sense is that that's an excellent example of where you're considering this matrix of domination, like where there's a preferred social domination order, and so where whiteness is cast as a particular frame of superiority, then among a certain group of working class, anything that looks like racial equality threatens the hierarchy in ways that they would resist. And so they're participating in a racialized domination order because the class equity threatens the otherwise constructed hierarchy that they've kind of bought into, right? And so class is one of those interesting it's as slippery as everything else. We categorize and construct what class actually means. Do you have not enough? Do you have enough? Do you have more than enough? But then we start categorizing to suggest, how do you have not enough? I work, but I have not enough. I don't work, but I don't have enough. Or I work, I have enough, but I don't have as much as others. And so where's that working class thing? It's inviting us into a particular economic logic that kind of hides the overall arching domination order that's been set up that people have been kind of seduced into. So we haven't talked a lot about class, because class shows up in very different places, in very different ways, every place, and we don't have a good grasp on it. We also don't, at least in these, in the United States, or the failing to be United States, we actually don't have a lot of conversation. Class isn't a predominant way of thinking about division, so we don't have good language for it. We don't have good vocabulary, so I don't think we have a great analysis for it here.
So Ashley, sorry, Ash, you want to go ahead then, because Ashley has done a lot of thinking around those specific questions. But
yeah, this is a short point. I mean, I think this is precisely where an intersectional analysis is really important, because when you take an intersectional lens, that allows you to see the ways in which, being challenged on the class level can kind of push you into embracing certain racial stereotypes as a way of overcompensating. So if you're looking at both vectors together, you can see that dynamic in a way that you wouldn't see if you were just looking at one or the other. And that, I think that's so important politically, the way these vectors play off and co-opt each other. So to be able to trace that is really key.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump before you
Go, yes.
Okay. I'm just going to build on that sort of historical perspective, that there's very strong historical backing for the intersectionality of race and class. So when we look at U.S. Making of race in the ways that Professor Page highlighted, we can consider Bacon's Rebellion in colonial Virginia, right, where indentured whites, they weren't even white at the time, but indentured white servants and African servants united to challenge the colonial class. And the immediate result of that were the Virginia slave codes that gave privileges to poor whites, that limited indenture and basically punished the Africans in a different way and set new codes. So there's a direct relationship between this need to break class hierarchies and the invention of race as a natural category. And then you see that continuation really into the 19th century to now, how factory labor was divided by ethnicity, by race. So there's a very strong intersectionality between these things. That is, again, to think about accountability, that is very specifically, we talk about structures, but you can locate an agency, and sort of this white rage that made these laws that really invented race in an American sense, in an invention not being important, in the sense of not being important, but in the sense of being socially constructed.
Yeah, I think all of what my co-panelists have said is right on. I'll also say that I think one of the places that class analysis has to grow is that I think there is sometimes when we speak about class, the implicit and unacknowledged assumption that when we're talking about just class, we're talking about white working class people, when actually class is a highly racially and gender patterned experience, that the vast majority of working class or working poor people in this country and in this world are not white men, though that is the dominant image. That's the dominant image that we have when we're talking about class in isolation from some of these other factors. And so one of the key, I think, helpful contributions of intersectionality to thinking about class is that if we're not talking about the way that class is raced and gendered, we're actually not doing a good class analysis. That's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, this white intersectional. Anna.
Thanks, Atalia. My name is Anna. I'm a staff member at the Kroc Institute, and I actually have here another question from someone following online. This is from Helena, who's one of our MGA students in the field. And the question is, as we keep in mind the nuances and complexities of intersectionality, we try not to romanticize the quote unquote local communities because there are social hierarchies present within the local. Furthermore, those quote unquote most oppressed by the system can take on oppressive rhetoric against other groups or recreate recursive power dynamics. Mariam Akaba says, this is why we must be quote unquote survivor-centered and not survivor-led. What are your insights regarding the nuances when engaging intersectionality while also attempting to have locally led, survivor-led interventions?
Yeah, David.
I can say something, and just like really very excited to hear Miriam's name raised in this context as someone who's been doing really important peace building work, first in Chicago and now in New York for a very, very long time, and someone whose work and thought has really influenced me on a personal level. And I think one of the things that differentiates intersectionality from other theories about the way that race and class and gender and sexuality come together is what has been called by Patricia Hill Collins as the working hypothesis of the equivalency of oppressions, which means moving away from what Betita Martinez has called the oppression Olympics, and moving away from the frame that there is something like most oppressed, right, as the way to frame or ground interventions. It doesn't help us get anywhere, I don't think, to try to say like, well, is it better to have been the subject of a hate crime on the basis of your sexuality or on the basis of your race, right? Like these are the kinds of questions that some of the most oppressed, least oppressed leads us or forces us into. And I think one of the important steps that intersectionality gives us for thinking about responses to oppression is refusing the frame of ranking oppressions and thinking rather about structures that inframe or connect experiences of homophobia and sexism and racism and capitalism and imperialism to one another in projects of mutual emancipation and community-based liberation.
And I guess the place to add to that is when the movements, the action, the responses are survivor-led, intersectionality is part of the analysis, but trauma healing is part of the way forward. And so the folks who are doing the work, we have to allow them to address their traumagenic experiences in ways that don't require them to kind of continue cycles of victimhood and violence just from a perpetrator perspective. And so the leading out of those conditions also is going to require us to do trauma-informed kind of work.
Okay, so I think we have time for one quick question, and then we'll conclude.
My name's Colleen. I'm an undergraduate peace studies major. I just have a question about, I feel like right now in social movements, there's this idea that people who have privilege, whether it's white people, cis people, straight people, have a responsibility to use their privilege to like amplify the voices of more marginalized people within a movement. I'm just wondering your thoughts on if that can exist if we have an overarching goal of dismantling a system where people have such stark privilege. Like, should we be using that privilege while also trying to get rid of it?
Thank you, and I'm so glad that we got the voice of an undergraduate student, so thank you. Yeah. Do you want to?
So I'm not sure that the idea is about using the voice and the place of privilege to amplify somebody else's voice. Don't do work for them, do your own work, right? There's plenty of work among people that work that needs to be done that doesn't require that you do for others, because that's still kind of in that same charitable savior modality of working on behalf of somebody else. And I think that what happens is when folks who are experiencing the upside of systems begin to recognize that they are equally oppressed by those systems. They just get the benefit of it, but it's still an oppressive system, right? That they're inside of that and that their identities, their capacities are equally constrained just by having to live inside those systems. Then they realize that there's work for them to do that work.
Other thoughts?
I heard pass the mic instead of speaking for people. Colleague already sort of mentioned about what voices are missing. I think sometimes they are disappeared and it is an endless search. And, from a historian's perspective, what's left is, uneven and unfair and really yoked to colonization. But maybe passing the mic is a start.
I mean, the metaphor that came to my mind was making the space for those voices. So definitely.
I think I would also say that what people mean by leveraging your privilege actually varies a lot. And I do think that there are lots of social movement practices that have developed around what it means to leverage privilege in a way that is not saviorist, right? And I think
Can you unpack it a little bit? Just how does it look like?
Sure, yeah. So I think there are ways in which I like to think about this as a kind of tension between two principles of social organizing work, right? One of those principles is articulated very famously by Audre Lorde: the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? So if you're inside a system of oppression, right, or exploitation, the tools that are going to be the most available to you, or the tools that already exist, might themselves perpetuate rather than unseat the very system you're trying to aim them at. That's one side. The other side comes from Malcolm X, who says, by any means necessary, right? And these are actually two completely incompatible, right, ways of thinking about doing our work, right? In a social movement context, there's a lot of debate and overlap between these perspectives, or not so much overlap, but debate and engagement between them. And I think if there are ways to think about leveraging privilege that at least can ask of itself the question, how much is this a master's tool? And in conjunction with the question, how urgent is it? Like, how much does this problem need to be solved right at this second with whatever is at my fingertips? I think the answers to these questions are deeply contextual. So for me, questions of tactics and strategy are dictated by the situation, not necessarily by grand principles, though they can be informed by and pushed more critically by those grand principles and theory. I don't know if that was a satisfactory answer. It's kind of just giving a question back to you. Sorry.
And on this note, let's conclude and thank our panelists.